Don't take this personally. Viking Warrior, 793 Common Era. Probably.
You're listening to History Unscripted with Gabriel and Carl.
Back at it again. History with Gabriel and Carl. We want to thank you guys all who are listening. We really appreciate it. Even if it's just one listen through, it still helps us. We're trying to get this thing off the ground, and I don't know what better topic to begin with today than the Vikings. I think they're the most probably well-known yet misunderstood warriors of history. Vikings are everywhere. Football teams, high school teams. We hear it in our language. There's movies. The Marvel movies have Thor, right? They're so in our culture, yet they're so misunderstood. And so our goal today, I think, is to try to clear some of these myths, to really find out who they were and the true history behind the Vikings, because it really is fascinating. They had their tentacles everywhere, from England. Actually, let's go even further west, from Iceland, Greenland, maybe North America, all the way to the Middle East and everywhere in between. So let's dive on in. Carl, just give me your first thoughts on from your research, the Vikings. What are some of your first thoughts?
I would say some of my first thoughts is kind of what you said. I didn't realize how influential they were in the world of ancient Europe. You hear stories of the Vikings, and they're the raiders from the north, the scourge of God, the great heathens. And even as a self-proclaimed history lover, I kind of put them into that pocket of, a nuisance, I would say. But researching them further, they were no people to be messed with. And they definitely surprised a lot of the powers that were controlling Europe at the time when they finally decided to actually go all in and go into a conquering mode.
I couldn't agree more. But I also, just a little caveat, I like the term history buff because we have to carry the weight of history sins with us at all times through our research.
Very philosophical.
Yeah, so let's just stick to that history buff. But yeah, the Vikings. So, when you do, I feel like when you're in school and you learn about the Vikings, it's just like they kind of appear out of nowhere. But in reality, that's not really the case. They've been trading and messing with different cultures since like the Bronze Age. In fact, in some of my research, I found they would find like grave sites from like dated to the Bronze Age, both men and women, which is really interesting. They kind of buried both men and women of high status very similarly, with different things that you would take into the afterlife. But again, they've been around. The Scandinavians, the Norwegians, from Denmark, the Danes, they've been intertwined with so many different cultures for thousands of years before the Vikings, really even the Vikings, quote unquote, appear on the scene. Because Vikings, Carl, it's just like a job, right?
Yeah.
Would you agree?
Yeah, they didn't consider themselves Vikings per se. What they did was Viking. That was their word for warrior or brave soldier or something along those lines. They thought of themselves as Scandinavians, as Danes. And so, yeah, there's even Roman soldiers had accounts of clashes with people from that part of the world. And in my research, I found that some Viking ships actually sacked and looted Rome itself.
That's fascinating. Those are some of the first descendants of the quote unquote Vikings. Now we'll use Vikings is just kind of the way it's used today. But again, we just want to disclaimer that the Vikings is just a job. They did not consider some of the Vikings. And you have to remember the Vikings did not write things down right after they did it. There's no journal accounts of Ivan the Boneless or Bjorn the tree hugger, probably not tree hugger, probably more like tree chopper, writing in his journal, like, Dear Journal, today I raped and pillaged and murdered. Like, that's not what they did. Now, there is stuff written down by the Vikings years and years and years and years later in the sagas, and those certainly have a kernel of truth. But what you have to do as historians or history buffs is you have to find that kernel of truth. Or if you want something a little bit closer to the Viking period, which is, roughly 793 to about 10 or about 1000 Common Era, right? It's going to be from non-Viking sources. It's going to be from the Christians. It's going to be from the medieval, like the peasantry, maybe not the peasantry, I meant like the priests, the people that are being attacked by the Vikings, and then also the Muslims. The Muslims of the Middle East wrote a lot about the Vikings. And in fact, probably at some point, I'm going to share one of my favorite accounts. So again, the Vikings did not write things down. So we have to realize that when we're reading about them and doing research, that it's hard to get into the minds of the people that were doing the acts because, again, they aren't writing this stuff down. But they come from, what we do know is they come from a very, very tough place to live. It's cold. Winter is long. Farming is tough. A lot of food, but you really got to work for it, right? You got to go fish. You got to go hunt. Farming is going to be very difficult. In that environment breeds really tough warriors. I'm not saying that if you look down in like the desert, certainly the Egyptians were tough warriors. Certainly, the Spartans were. But I think there's something so unique about just this incredibly cold up in Norway and Sweden, and just windswept along the coast, the North Sea, just something about that I think breeds hardiness that you don't get in warmer climates. Now, that's just an opinion of mine. Carl, would you agree or disagree? What are your kind of thoughts on this, the environment that if you are a Viking child destined to be a warrior, what are you growing up in?
Yeah, definitely tough climate, in which that makes the animals in your area tougher. The topography of Norway is also very rugged, very mountainous, very forest.
Mhm.
And so there the terrain is tough. The winters, like you said, are extremely bitter. And so everything is trying to kill you
Mhm.
because, you're not fighting against mostly other people. You're also fighting against bears and wolves and moose and things in the water that want to kill you.
Mhm.
And so you have to be tough to survive. You know,
Yeah.
um, now we'll get into this in a later episode when we talk about like the Italian peninsula, but typically warmer climates like that, um, you don't have to worry about those things quite as much.
Mhm.
And so people tend to kind of err on the side of not laziness per se, but they're able to let their guard down a little more.
Right. Right. And you have a longer growing season, warmer climates. And so I think, again, that fight for food is not as intense maybe in these warmer climates. But that's not to say the Vikings didn't eat well. One of the most fascinating things, and again, I love food, so of course it's going to be one of the first things I talk about, is the fact that it does seem as though Vikings, and again, maybe this is one of the reasons why they were so successful, is they actually probably would have been a little bit better nourished than your average peasant in medieval Europe, is what we would think of medieval Europe. And it makes sense. They do have access to a lot of food. There's a lot of protein. There's a lot of large animals. The big deer that roam Europe, right? I can't remember if they're called like elk, if like, well, Americans would consider elk, but they've got moose. Of course, they've got bear, and they can farm. And of course, they can have livestock, and they can go to the ocean. So when things are clicking, right, you can get a buttload of food. And I do think the Vikings were successful in again almost all the research I found, which kind of surprised me, is that they would have been a level up, I think, in the nourishment, which I think leads to them being bigger people. I think the average Viking I found was like 5'9", 5'10", which for us is pretty small, but for the medieval period, they would have been 3 inches taller, extra 20 pounds of muscle. And again, these Vikings are coming from the middle class. They aren't coming from the lower class or even the upper class. They're coming from the middle class. So I think they would have had access to the food. And, they clearly had time to train for war, right? That was clearly a priority in their life. And you see it in the religion, right? When you're a Viking and you die, your heaven is literally war and feast. And so that's the culture that they're growing up in, and that's not to say there aren't other elements, but, when you're thinking about the Vikings and why they're doing what they're doing, you have to remember war is just a big part of it. And it's an honorable thing. But they also are traders, and so again, they can be peaceful too. There's so much evidence. I think I found that there was one Viking, or not even Viking, because this was during like the Roman times, that was buried with one of the most complete Roman, like maybe dining sets or some sort of Roman set of like metalwork. And it's like one of the most complete ones we've ever found. So again, they're trading with the Romans, so they have the ability, I think, just survival, they're so good at surviving. But so why do they then, right? Why do they branch out, Carl, to start the raids on England? I think that's a question, we got to answer, is what motivates them to head out to England on these long ships? And there's a lot we could talk about with that. So I'll let you dive in first.
Yeah, I would say a point that I forgot to put in
Okay.
um, was when you have a situation where you're unable to grow and provide for yourself everything that you need within a growing season, you're then forced to take it from somebody else, which then also just, you have to be tough by necessity
Right.
in that aspect as well. But as far as going into England, this is one of those separation of fact from saga. And because the chronicled fact mostly came from English monks. And they were like, I don't know why they came. They just did. And all I know is one morning I wake up and there's a couple thousand really hairy, angry dudes.
Yeah.
And so that's their reasoning. But the Viking saga is there was a absolutely legendary Viking king Jarl named Ragnar Lothbrok, and we could make an entire episode
Oh yeah.
on his life. He was even today he would be an incredible military genius, military master. Um, and one thing that was unique about Ragnar, especially at the time, was he was known throughout the Viking world.
Mm.
And they were so isolated that just wasn't heard of up until him. And so, as the legend goes, there was a king of Northumbria in the northern part of England who killed Ragnar, and Ragnar prophesied that his sons would come and take revenge. And so then his sons, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, Ubba, and Bjorn Ironsides, amassed an army and came to take revenge. That's what the saga says.
Mhm.
But there's also a lot of historical evidence pointing to Ragnar settling in Ireland and raiding the western coast of England, kind of in the Wales area. But that's on the opposite side of the island as the kingdom of Northumbria.
Mhm.
So there's a little disconnect on exactly what happened.
Right. Yeah, and again, it's that fact from fiction, and again, that saga is written down, many years after, but there's a kernel of truth in there. And I think, I mean, when you get down to it, they're human beings. They're living in a violent time. And it's not that the Vikings were even necessarily more violent than, like the European nations fighting. Like Charlemagne, who's living during the same time, he's incredibly brutal to anyone who's not Christian. He's slaughtering. It's like you convert or you get slaughtered. I think it's the fact that they did target monasteries. They targeted the church in a way. Not that they were like bringing their religion to England, but why are they targeting the church is because there's wealth, there's riches, there's slaves. Right, it's easy loot. I did some research that maybe in Ireland, the priests were a little bit better armed. In fact, I came across this. There's potentially like a place in Ireland where there might have been a little scuffle and the Vikings actually got beat. But in England, where, you think of like Lindisfarne, right? That first Viking raid in 793, they were completely like, for all intents and purposes, they were defenseless. I'm not saying there weren't some dudes with swords maybe, but they were completely defenseless. And the Vikings could, like, why trade, right? Why negotiate? Why haggle when you can take? And
Yeah.
so I think you have this mixture of, I think things are getting probably overpopulated in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, maybe. Uh, that's pushing these adventures out, right? And there's these guys that, again, they're coming from a culture of glory and war and riches. They love silver and they love gold and they love slaves, right? That's the three things a man needs, right? Gold, silver, and slave. At least it was for a Viking. And so, yeah, they turn on England. And as you mentioned, though, then you have these legends and things grow and stories are told. And eventually, that leads to the Great Heathen Army, which I don't know if we're quite ready to talk about that. Is there anything, with those first initial raids? Maybe we should just take a moment and talk about Lindisfarne, that first raid that's kind of kicked it off. So do you have anything, maybe if we just kind of put a pause and like, let's talk about those first Viking raids before we get to the Great Heathen Army, which again, I actually don't think many Americans know about at all. I think most Americans do know about Viking raids, but when we get to the Great Heathen Army, that may be news to a lot of people. But is there anything about maybe that first one that you stumbled across? If not, I've got some stuff I could talk about.
Well, I personally went more so heavy into the Great Heathen Army
Okay.
itself. Um, but yeah, to your point, like the English had absolutely no idea what was coming for them
Right.
when the Vikings landed, and the Vikings were like, "This is the easiest race we've had in forever.
Right.
Why would we not come back?"
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, again, those stories are told, and it's like there's wealth here, there's slaves. And of course, I think they want to settle too, because it doesn't take very long for them to settle down. So yeah, so Lindisfarne is kind of the first, it's the quintessential Viking raid on a monastery. It's an island. So the priests, there were like priests, but there was also probably some workers too. The Vikings come in 793. And it's not even like that was a shock seeing ships. Like if you're a priest at this time or you're a farmhand and you're looking out on the coast and it's an island, and you see ships rolling up, that's actually probably not a huge shock. But as they get closer and closer and you notice they're different, and the next thing you know, you have these ironclad soldiers with these big wooden shields rushing at you, and they just take and they loot and they kill. And then again, word spreads. This is an easy. This is easy, and then you start having more Vikings and more Vikings and more Vikings, and then they want to maybe settle down, right? And they're actually again creating an army, which now I'm going to let you kind of dive into the history of the Great Heathen Army of the Vikings, which is kind of the culmination, right, of I would say the peak of the Viking raids in England is this Great Heathen Army. So let's spend some time talking about that. So I'll let you go ahead and explain that to our listeners.
Yeah, this is a topic where, uh, to be honest, like I've spent tons of time on just this topic alone,
Mhm.
and I could go so much deeper than I already have.
Okay.
And So
So
this by itself could
just send
100%
it,
be
dude.
its
Just
own
send it.
episode. So I'll kind of scratch the surface on here. Um, but what we do know is that Ragnar's sons were leading the Great Heathen Army. Um, I
Which is
think
just
the
the
reason,
coolest name. I mean, it's like if you're gonna have a name of your army, like I want it to be the Great Heathen Army. That
yeah,
just is that's so great.
it's just, yeah, it's awesome.
Yeah.
Um, but I, if I were to guess, kind of tapping into their human side, there's probably two reasons why they invaded England the way that they did. And I think number one is because they thought, well, these raids have been really fruitful for almost 100 years. How much more loot can we get if we just took it all? Um, and then the other one is having the uniqueness of a legendary Viking. All of his sons partake in this grand conquest. They were probably thinking and talking to themselves, saying like, "Hey, Dad's like really popular. Dad's a legend. We got to live up to that somehow. We have to make our own names known. How do we do that? Well, what if we take over a whole country?" Um, so I think that's part of it. But the thing about the Great Heathen Army that surprised me the most is just how close they came to conquering all of England. They were within one military victory away from conquering all four of the kingdoms, which
Maybe
when
you should just explain real fast. So England is divided up at this point, which does make it easier for the Vikings to raid and stuff. So maybe if you want to explain, because
yeah,
you mentioned kingdoms, and some of our listeners be like kingdoms, like hasn't England been England forever?
yeah, that's what I thought too. Um, so at this time, the Great Heathen Army, they landed in about 865, and at that time, there's four major kingdoms in what we would consider England. And so there's East Anglia, which is kind of northeast of London, kind of that area. There's Mercia, which is pretty much the central part of England. Northumbria, which is northern England and southern Scotland, kind of in that swath, and then Wessex, which is the southern stretch of the island.
Thank you.
And when they landed, um, Northumbria was in the middle of a civil war, and then obviously Wessex, Mercia, and East Anglia didn't really communicate with each other. And so, just as you said, it was pretty easy pickings for the Vikings to come in and take over. Um, and up until this point, the kings of England were able to pay the Vikings off. Just say, you know what, fine. Here's some gold, here's some silver. Now, go away.
Yeah.
Um, but that didn't work this time. Um, but something else that really astonished me was how smart they were tactically,
Hmm.
um, for being a primarily raiding, pillaging, plundering nation. When it came down to it, they didn't want to face you in open battle, but if they did, they were able to outsmart you.
Mm.
And yeah, completely took the English by surprise. And they weren't very good sieging in the classical sense, but they were extremely effective defensively.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, which I found extremely fascinating. And I counted at least three times where they baited Saxon soldiers into rushing prematurely into an opening in a wall or a lightly defended area. And as soon as a majority of the force got in, they closed in and slaughtered them.
Oh wow.
Yeah. And like I said before, they use this tactic and others, which we can get into on a later episode. And they didn't suffer a major loss in 7 years while
Wow.
conquering England.
Wow.
Yeah,
I mean, that's impressive. And again, yes, is England weaker? Yes. Are they fighting these full blown battles? No. But that is impressive to not lose a major battle. And it shows it in tactical intelligence. They know when to fight and they know when not to fight. They weren't just these guys go "Rah!" like swinging like axes and like just charging in. Again, they had, I think, a sophistication that maybe is underappreciated in what they're
yeah,
doing. Kind of
yeah,
like you think of even like the Comanche, right? Of like the Native American warriors on the horseback, right? You link it of them as just these kind of, they're real brave, they're real savage. Um, but when you really dive into the Comanche, you realize how tactically efficient they were and how they had a much more sophisticated society. I think the Vikings are very similar to that in a way, just different, right? They're using long ships, they're not using horses. So yeah, I just want to add that there for sure. So again, let's continue about this great heathen army. What's kind of the what kind of how does all that end for the poor English? And I say that with sympathy in my heart.
um, yeah. Definitely took them very off guard
Mm,
because once again, like just try to get your mindset into the English perspective of it. Is the Vikings were a nuisance up
hmm
until this point. They came, they pillaged, they sacked monasteries and coastal villages, took what they wanted and left.
Right.
And so when that is your perception of a people for almost 100 years, when they come with a mass army, you kind of think they're going to do the same thing and you underestimate them. And then all of a sudden, they go systematically
Mm,
capturing your largest cities, your best defended
hmm
cities,
hmm
and they're bigger than you thought they were. They're smarter than you thought they were. They're
Right.
more driven than you thought they were. They're
Yeah.
tactically better than you thought they were, or better
Yeah.
than you are yourself.
Yeah.
They're also better warriors than you thought they were.
Right.
They they're better politicians than you thought they were,
Mm,
which was something I didn't expect. Well, they
right.
played into the politics of England extremely well.
Right.
Um,
Because it was divided, right? And they could use that.
They're divided, they used it, they put the right people in the right scenarios and the right times and created tension within the kingdoms
Mm,
themselves. And yeah, they were masters at it. Um, and so all these things are happening as well as being, according to the English, bloodlusty warriors.
right. Right.
And so it was a very psychological thing for them as well.
100%.
Because I mean, you think of fighting a
Mm,
berserker warrior at the time, which he's high on drugs,
yeah.
claim,
Truman, dude.
and
Joe Rogan.
he's
Joe Rogan would be a berserker. 100%.
yeah, 100%.
I mean, that dude, yeah, that dude loves talking about shrooms and psychedelics. But that's seriously what it would have been, right? I mean, they aren't doing methamphetamines like the German soldiers in World War II. I mean, it's probably some sort of shrooms and alcohol mix, I would think.
Yeah, mead. What I found is a mixture of very really potent mead and a highly concentrated mushroom soup,
Right. Okay.
and
Yeah.
so. Um, and then the whole time they're fighting, they're screaming about getting to their version of heaven,
Yeah. Which is
and
just more of what they're doing, dude. It's
they're
just
not
more.
feeling pain. I mean, I'd be scared.
Yeah.
Um, but to answer your initial question, how did it end for them? Um, like I said previously, the English were seriously within one loss away from being
Mhm.
completely taken over.
Wow.
But what happened was Alfred the Great of Wessex, he changed his entire military system.
Right.
And so what he did was he created the boroughs, which
Okay.
every town had a standing militia and made their own defensive. fortifications.
Okay.
And he came up with the concept of having a full-time standing military where their
Okay.
job was solely
Mm,
fighting. Because at the
gotcha.
time, there were a lot of conscripted peasants, which
Right. Right.
that doesn't really work when you're fighting against an army where their only objective is conquer.
Right.
And so he mobilized these forces, which were able to respond quickly.
That's the key. Quick.
Yeah. And so after basically marching through the three of the four kingdoms of England, they ran into basically a stalemate with Wessex. And it was just like they traded blows. It was kind of a loss for a loss, a win for a win.
Mm,
Just traded back and forth for a couple of years. And the Vikings just kind of said, you know what? We've had enough. Like we're kind of done. We've conquered a bunch. We've got enough land. We've been doing this for a decade. Like we're kind of done. And so then there was a peace treaty signed, and half of what the Vikings had conquered stayed under Danish control, and that was dubbed Danelaw. And the rest of it was given back to the English kingdoms. And funnily enough, um, during their raids, they had gotten a reinforcement called the Great Summer Army, led
okay.
by Guthrum. And one of Guthrum's right hand men, um, he, when the treaty was signed, he took a bunch of people and actually went south
Mm,
into France and founded Normandy.
mm,
And 200 years later, the Normans would invade England and conquer all
right.
of it. So if you
Right.
want to think about it in a kind of a roundabout way,
Hmm.
the Vikings did end up conquering all of England
Right.
just 200 years later. And it's so fascinating to me that you could have potentially had two people that came from the same village in Norway came to England. One stayed in England, one went to France, and
Right.
then their descendants fought against each other.
Each other.
Yeah, yeah, that's a fascinating thing to think about.
I yeah, dude. I love that. Just hearing you say that. I mean, that a lot of that is news to me. I just didn't, the connections from that. Like where knights even come from are now connected to the Vikings. There again, it forces these places to rethink their militaries. I mean, they really rock the world of anyone they encountered. And maybe that is not warfare because, I mean, they get England or they get what they want, but that's not where they stop, right? They do go east and fight against the Muslim caliphates, but the Muslim caliphates of the Middle East are a little bit better organized. And again, they're a little quicker. They can respond a little faster. So the Vikings don't take a lot of territory necessarily in the Middle East the way they do over in Europe. In fact, I read this one account of these Vikings who did kind of sack like an Islamic city, but they hung around too long, and then they get slaughtered by the Muslim forces who were most likely on horseback shooting arrows, and that is something I do think the Vikings would struggle with. I think like just hand to hand combat. I mean, man on man, you know, they're whooping everybody. But I do think, when you get to Middle East and you have these Islamic caliphates and they're on horseback and they're shooting bows and arrows from horseback, I do think the Vikings struggle with that. So as you go east, you find the Vikings doing just more trading, but they're still there, right?
Yeah,
They've got their tentacles there. You've got the Vangarian Guard. I think, hope I said that right. And they are the Byzantine emperor's bodyguard, his highest warriors. There are again, they're interacting with Muslims, they're interacting with Christians. And so they really kind of 900 on, they have their tentacles almost all around the world. And that's not even talking about their exploration of Greenland, Iceland, and North America. I'll be honest with you, I didn't really even get to that in the 2 weeks we had to study them. But I do want to read this account from this Muslim source. I found it so fascinating. This Muslim, his name is Ahmed ibn Fadlan, and he is traveling along the Volga River in Russia, and he's encountering these like Bulgars, right? Like that ethnicity. I've got it up, like link here, so I'm just kind of trying to read real fast. And he's along the Volga River in Russia. He's meeting a lot of Viking trading groups, which again, the Vikings end up, like the Rus, Russia, that again has its ties to the Vikings. But I want to really read this account and we can kind of just talk about it. So this isn't even all of the account either. I have never seen bodies more perfect than theirs. Man, that's a compliment. Again, we talk about like, what did the Vikings look like, right? Were they these massive bodybuilding like warriors? Probably not. But if this guy, and he's riding in, I should probably say he's riding in 921. So let's see, about 120 years after the Viking raid in Lindisfarne, which starts it off, which kind of shows in 120 years, the Vikings are already establishing kingdoms. They're already in Russia area. They're encountering Muslim Turks. I mean, again, in 120 years, they are the greatest adventurers of all time. So anyways, I digress, of course. They were like palm trees. And I mean, that in itself, I said a lot of compliments in my life, but I've never said someone was a palm tree. Right, right. So again, I'm not entirely sure what that means exactly, what he's referencing. Unless it's again just they were tall, strong warriors. They were fair and ruddy. They wear neither coats nor caftans, but a garment that hangs on one side and leaves one hand free. Each one of them carries an axe, a sword, and a knife, and is never parted from any of the arms we have mentioned. So again, a culture of fighting. Their swords are broad-bladed and grooved like the Frankish ones. From the tips of his toes to his neck, each man is tattooed in dark green with designs and so forth. So that kind of speaks to the psychological effect, And I even think the Romans, when they're fighting the Gauls and those groups in northern, kind of above the Alps, I do think there's talk about these are tattooed warriors they're fighting. All their women wear on their bosoms circular brooches made of iron, silver, copper, or gold, according to their husband's wealth. Around their necks, each woman wears a torque of gold or silver. For each man, as soon as he accumulates 10,000 dirhams, some sort of money, has a torque made for his wife. Every time he increases his wealth, 10,000, he has another torque made for his wife, so one woman may wear many torques. So again, I just want to kind of dissect that. And I know you maybe don't have the reading right in front of you. But is there anything that kind of stuck out to you, I guess, from that description? Because again, this is, assuming the dude isn't lying, right? I mean, this is a pretty good description, potentially, of what the Vikings, even if this is 120-ish years after the first Viking raids, what they would have looked like. So is there anything you just kind of want to mention about that?
Just that his mentioning that they always had their weapons on them. They were always ready.
Right.
And that
Right.
I found that when they were going across England as well, is that there was a couple of times where they tried to take on a smaller force of Vikings, just like foraging or hunting and whatever. And the Saxons endured heavier losses than they were willing to accept,
Right.
just because they were always ready.
Yeah.
And I also found that there was a site near Repton, England, where they found Egyptian and Mesopotamian coins
Oh,
in
wow.
England during the Great Heathen Army of the 1860s.
Wow.
So ships had already gone to that part of the world and
Hmm.
back before they invaded England.
That's, I mean, that the trade again, that's again, these they could do more than just fight. I mean, they were very efficient traders. And let's talk about why were they so efficient at trading and robbing? It's because of their ships. And I do think again, we have a limited time here. We may have to end up making this a part two, right? We may have to take this two parts. How about this, viewers, listeners? If you want a part two about the Vikings, just let us know in the comments. But their ships, their long ships were incredible. They could range from 40 to 75 feet. They could go in shallow water. They could go in the rivers. They could go up a river, attack, and they'll be gone in the open ocean. And again, that speed, you think of speed kills, right? That is what reason why they were so efficient. One, at trading, and two, at doing the raiding, and eventually the conquering. Is there anything
Yeah,
that
they
you
were
found about the long ships or anything like that you want to share?
just that they were unique for the time because they were so versatile.
Right.
Um, they were shallow, but were very wide, and
Yes.
so they were able to take the head-on collisions of waves because they were very wide, just
Mhm.
basically acting like their own outriggers.
Right.
Um, but because they were so shallow, they were able to steer extremely quickly,
Yep.
and to, like you said, go into shallower water and be operated by oars very effectively. And so, um, like a typical Viking raid, part of it is showing up very quickly, but then the other part is leaving very quickly.
Right.
And so they were able to do that with oars nearly as good as they were with the sails.
Right.
And so they could pull right up onto the beach in their big ships, do their pillaging, run back, and just grab the oars or push it off
Hmm.
and to get going, and then just turn around, drop sails, and they're gone.
Right. Right. And again, that kind of, they can't be, in some ways, we probably should have started with that, you know, because that is, I mean, it's really incredible. And again, that level of sophistication it took years to build just the sail for these long ships. And so again, if you're thinking of Viking society, that speaks to a level of sophistication in communication and organization to build these ships in mass so that they can raid and conquer and trade around the world. And it's quite almost literally around the known world at this time. In fact, here's an account again from another Arabic Muslim source. It says, again, this is around 844, is when this is being written, on Viking attacks on the coast of Spain. They used to come from the sea, large ships with square sails that can sail forward or backward. They were manned by men called magus, who were big, brave, and strong, and excellent seamen. When they attacked, the coastal peoples fled in fear of them. They only appeared every 6 or 7 years, and never in less than 40 ships, and sometimes up to 100. They overcame everybody they met at sea, robbed them, and took them captive. I mean, that's a really cool. I mean, it's easy saying it's cool from the safety of my home. I'm sure some peasant in
Right.
Spain is like, this is awful. I don't like this. Get them away from me. But again, they're on the coast of Spain, like 50 years after they appear in England, 50 years later, we're in Spain. I mean, to go down, like, anyone, I wish we could pull up a map of Europe or, that whole area. I mean, that's quite the trek. And they did so without the astrolabe. They did so without their maps. And I know it's shocking, right? They couldn't go, all right, I'm going to type it in here. I need to find this village in Spain I heard about on Facebook. Like, they're just doing it from their just skill at sea. There's no Viking maps that I know of that they had maps even that they were passing down. It was probably word of mouth. It was probably, hey, you go by this rock, turn right, avoid the
Right.
turbulence, and next thing you know, you've got it. you're in where you need to be.
I know some people that get lost going 5 blocks with a GPS.
Yeah, dude, that's me. I mean, I take my GPS everywhere. And so, I just think we need to have a little humility when looking at the Vikings, and just they weren't these brutish warriors that, were just there to kill and conquer. And they definitely were violent. I mean, the Blood Eagle, that torture. Now, there's some debate whether the Blood Eagle, where they spread your ribs, if that actually happened or if it's just a kind of element of the sagas. But they were violent. But they were also sophisticated. They were organized. They were intelligent. They were tough warriors that really did change history. Again, they got their tentacles and everything. Some of our English words come from the Old Norse language when they're interacting in England. So much of our culture is built around the Vikings. So, is there anything else you want to cover? We're about out of time. Again, we can, in the comments, if you want this to be a part 2, there's so much more about the Vikings we can go into. One thing is, even then you have like the whole side of like the women, where women also warriors. And there is like at least one grave that they found where a woman is buried with all of her weapons, and actually like a kind of like a board game that's about combat. And actually that's fascinating. The fact that they have like some sort of game, that she was buried with, that showed that she probably knew some sort of tactical skill. Now, is that to say it's maybe not quite as overblown as Hollywood? Hollywood loves to run with that stuff. Were there Viking women in every raid? No, but they clearly were there. And women did have a little bit in Viking society. Women did have, like, if you're a Viking woman, you had it better than if you were like in England or France. And I hate to say it, being a Christian, I hate to say it'd be like in Christian Europe. At least Viking women could initiate divorce. So, that's not that divorce is good or anything, but I feel like it's sometimes like, it needs to happen, especially when there's abuse. And so at least Viking women could do that. But yeah, is there anything else you just kind of want to share with the audience about the Vikings that, before we go, and we'll just see if we talk about this next time or not.
Uh, Honestly, I just kind of want to echo your sentiment that you just brought up, is that even myself kind of put them into the box of just bloodthirsty, crazy, hair on fire,
Hmm.
lunatic warriors. Um, but I didn't realize how sophisticated they were, how planned out, how thought out they were,
Right.
how well they could play the politics game, and just exactly how deep their influences ran in Europe,
Right.
Asia, and yeah, still happens today. And because of that, there is so much material that we could cover.
Hmm.
Like I said, we could do an entire episode on just Ragnar Lothbrok,
Right.
and on just Leif Erikson, on just Eric the Red, or on just um, King. I can't remember his name right now, but the king that unified Norway.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. We haven't even talked about when they become Christian, because they do
it,
become Christian.
there's so much material that we could talk about with them,
Right.
and that's something that I just kind of thought like, yeah, it happened. Yeah, this guy was a big player, but exactly how big they were honestly can't be overstated.
Right. Right. I agree. So again, listeners, if you want us to do a part 2, let us know. If there's anything about the Vikings you want us to discuss, maybe you want us to discuss how far in North America did they make it? What was it like settling Iceland, Greenland, that whole area? Maybe a little bit more about the Vanguard Guard, anything. This is History Unscripted. We just talk history. So with that though, thank you for listening. Hit the subscribe button. We really appreciate it. Thank you for listening to History Unscripted with Gabriel and Carl. I'm Gabriel.
Well,
All right, we'll see you next time.